Hey guys, how you all doing? I hit record on this video, and then I just kind of like sat there and stared at my... I don't even have a script for these videos nowadays. I just have like a recording screen, and I just kind of stared at it for 5 minutes because I don't really know how to start this video. Essentially, this is like a little bit of a don't use this build, just take inspiration from it kind of video. Because the build I'm about to show you is bad. It is not good. You should not do this build the way I've done it in this video, but the concepts are there. I have just failed to execute. Don't get me wrong, this build is effective. It's very hard not to be effective at rune level 168, and its spellcasting damage is excellent. However, everyone's spellcasting damage is excellent, or at least pretty good, or they have something that they use to kill gods with, right? Because at this point, at rune level 168, everybody's killed a god or two. The fatal flaw here, truly, is that I took this build too high. This build is truly perfect for rune level 94, but because my last video is rune level 94, I was like, let's jump up a few brackets, and I took it to 168, and that's just too dang high, man. I know I just spent like the last minute bemoaning this build, but I want other people to take inspiration from this build and do something better with it. Mostly in the department of what weapons it's using. I'm really happy with the spells on this build. They all do great damage. It's just I ended up using weapons that don't, I don't know, I guess the best way to put it is further the cause of this build. So let's dig into that a little bit. So this is my rune level 168 red druid. That's right, we are back on our color theory build making. This time the color is red. After getting the basic physical requirements I need for the weapons I want to use, which is a pretty standard mage process here, we dump all the rest of our points into various damage stats. In this case, it is split between Faith and Arcane. Since you're all attending my color theory lecture, it's time for a pop quiz. What theme or element is most closely associated with the color red in Elden Ring? Is it A, fire, B, blood, C, arcane, or D, all of the above? Alright, the answer is C. You people have taken far too many standardized tests. D, all of the above, is not the usual answer. Okay, please stop doing that. Now, Elden Ring likes to mess with us a lot and give things that shouldn't be red attributes. I have a whole section in this video dedicated to stolen valor of the color red. And we'll get into that later, as well as the lore of what it means that something is red in the game Elden Ring. But before we get there, let's talk about a couple of things with this build. Let's talk about weapons. Let's talk about, most importantly, what you're really all here for, is the Magery, the spell pseudo combos, and the giant hitboxes of death that I hit people with. Let's talk about those. So we've restricted ourselves to just red spells. Fortunately, Elden Ring is full of spells that are red or give off red auras. We have a couple of big damage doers, one of which is Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike, which is just an absurd spell that can hit all kinds of different things at all times. It's also not that hard to dodge, but it just has a couple of really useful elements to it, like the fact that it surrounds you with lightning, or the fact that it can be cast pretty quickly if uncharged. Most people already know about Big Red Lightning. Often, it doesn't really matter if they know about it or not, because it's still really good, has a giant hitbox, does lots of damage. Next one is Roar of Regalia, which I tend to just use behind walls and corners. That's my main use for it. Crazy that they added a better in every way version of Grail's Roar. Sure, it doesn't debuff your opponents, but that debuff in PvP was I think 5 or 7.5%. It really wasn't that much. And of course we have Dragon Claw, because Dragon Claw is one of the best spell comboers in the game. It's like if you can start your spell combo with Dragon Claw, you're already doing something right. The reason for that is because there's always the threat of the second hit. Everybody knows that any hits of Dragon Claw at all do a lot of damage. So nobody wants to get hit with it, much less twice. That's why you mix in a second spell instead of the second hit of Dragon Claw, in order to catch people who are going to be rolling away or something like that. I always found the spell combo of Dragon Claw into Bloodflame Talons a little silly, because you're like, why wouldn't I just hit them with another Dragon Claw? Like, if they're dumb enough to stick around for that first hit of Dragon Claw, why wouldn't I just hit them with the next hit? I know the actual purpose is to cancel the recovery of that second Dragon Claw hit, which is pretty significant. However, utility-wise, it's not like that useful. What I find to be a lot more fun is comboing that first hit of Dragon Claw into Furious Blade of Ansbach. Initially, I didn't like the Furious Blade at all. From neutral, it's a bad spell. Like, you can just simply roll backwards from it, and all of those hits will miss you. But if you set it up with something beforehand, it becomes quite good. If you have some decent pressure, maybe even asynchronous pressure, then you can really do something with it. But I really like Dragon Claw into the Furious Blade, especially if that first Dragon Claw hits. That's going to trip them up to the point where even if they roll away, they're going to get hit by some of the Furious Blade slashes. First in my rotation is actually Fire Serpent. I'm not thrilled about that. I might change that out because I think I cast it a little too often, especially considering my last build was also like abusing Fire Serpent as its asynchronous pressure engine, so to speak. Fire Serpent can combo into Dragon Claw if timed correctly, which is pretty fun. Not super reliable, but you know, fun nonetheless. But it's just hard to find a replacement for something that comes out pretty fast, does alright damage, but acts as another piece of pressure, but more importantly is also very red. It's kind of hard to find. No, I will not use Catch Flame. That shit is orange, man. This is kind of where I run into trouble with this build. As I've been making these mage builds, I've noticed I always need something to kind of split up and distract the party and create chaos. In my head, I've been referring to this as like the panic inducer. Other people might call this asynchronous pressure, but that's kind of a mouthful and doesn't really communicate the effect that I actually needed to have, which is to kind of like split up the party and let me just focus my firepower on one person and knock them out. For my Drowned build, that was a Great Oracular Bubble, and for my Cillian Onryu build, that was Glint Blade Trio, and for my Magma build, that was Rykard's Rancor. This build doesn't quite have that, but I think as I'm recording this video and doing a few invasions here and there, I'm slowly figuring out that it's Swarm of Flies. Which is funny because I was trying out Blood Boon early on with this build, and I was just like, I'm not going for bleed outs, and this doesn't really do that much damage, so like, why is it on here? But Swarm of Flies is slow moving, and it has really good tracking, which kind of forces whoever I've launched it at to just run away from it and make a concerted effort to actually dodge it. The one big downside with Swarm of Flies is that the cast speed is, like, unfortunately, but also thankfully, very slow. I think ultimately with this build, and we'll talk about this a little bit more with my weapons, I just need to lean into bleeding out folks a little bit more. I've often been very resistant to that, but I think if you're going to make a build with like 45 arcane or whatever I have, you gotta think at a certain point like, hey, maybe I should put some of that to use outside of just like pumping up the stats on the Dragon Communion seal. Hey, actually, I do inflict one kind of status effect, sort of, situationally. It's a spell that takes up 3, count them, 3 attunement slots. Are you kidding me? I mean, even in a game where everybody gets 10 attunement slots or whatever just by like walking around the world, 3 seems a little egregious, especially for a spell that is as bad as Scarlett Aeonia. And you have to beat the fucking hardest boss in the game to get Scarlett Aeonia, and it costs 35 faith. Why? Okay. Why is a spell that, like, you know, does a status effect, right? Why does that only cost faith? It costs 35 faith to cast. What are we doing? What are we doing, man? I'm crashing out over Scarlett Aeonia of all spells. It's not a good spell, but you know what? It's so cool to land, and it's a big red flower. How can a ascetic monk whose whole deal is being like tied to nature and mostly being red not cast Scarlett Aeonia? Anyways, I'm deeply upset because this is a really cool spell with like some really beautiful VFX. But it's dumb because you either hit someone directly with it and do 1200 damage, which is nice. We've talked about spells that do 1200 damage, and we do like them a lot on this channel. But you either do 1200 damage and knock this person to the ground, and then they don't take any like Scarlet Rot buildup. But if they properly like dodge the spell while it comes down, then they do take Scarlet Rot buildup. So So please, where's the logic in that? I think the spell would honestly be better if it just didn't do that initial explosion and you just had to like tank the hit, but the rot VFX remained and just built up rot on everybody in that vicinity. Like that would be a decent trade-off if in order to inflict rot on somebody, you like had to like tank a couple hits. This is of course in a hypothetical version of Elden Ring that doesn't have a dragon breath incantation that can just cover your screen full of rot, and also isn't entirely accessible from the very start of the game. Also a hypothetical version of Elden Ring that doesn't have the Anspur Rapier, which once again you can just run and go pick it up after beating 0 bosses. Anyways, this is all to say, I think it would be really cool if the only way to inflict rot in Elden Ring was to beat the rot goddess herself. Or actually, it would just be nicer if Scarlett Aeonia was like a significantly better spell. I try to think of this approach a little bit more, which is to buff things rather than just to like demand nerfs. Like I want them to buff Scarlett Aeonia in some way that gives me like a reason to use it outside of I just want to be a big red flower. Maybe we don't have to nerf everything all the time, but there's so many really cool things in this game that could just use a little bit of a buff and then could just start to compete with some of the ridiculous stuff that's in this game. That's all I really want. But hey, maybe in the next secret patch that FromSoft drops on Steam only with 0 patch notes and 0 Steam updates, maybe that will have a Scarlett Aeonia buff too. If you've been listening to this long, slightly coherent ramble about Scarlett Aeonia and all my gripes with it, and just the general balance of Scarlet Rot in Elden Ring, you might be thinking, hey, is this what you felt like kind of went wrong with the build? No, the answer is actually the weapons I was using. It goes deeper than this. So initially, I was all excited to use the Blood Fiend's Arm. In PvE, I had used that weapon to complete pretty much all of the DLC on this particular build when it launched, and it was really fun. And I mistakenly thought that the R2 on this colossal weapon was the same as the R2 that's on the Gazing Finger. And the Gazing Finger's R2 I love in PvP. It is not, in fact, the same R2. It has a slightly slower and unfortunately shorter R2 than the Gazing Finger, which was heartbreaking. Yeah, I know the Blood Fiend's Arm has a big blood explosion at the end of it when you land that R2, but it is just such a hard R2 to land when there's also like 2 other people casting their big nukes all the time because you're at rune level 168. So unfortunately the Blood Fiend's Arm ceased to be super usable for me. I then opted for a heavier, more agile weapon, which was a Flame Art infused curved greatsword. And this was actually a huge mistake. Not because that weapon isn't good, or because I wasn't killing my opponents, because I definitely was. This is gonna sound like the dweebiest shit you've ever heard in your life, but it just didn't fit the build and never felt really good using it. At a certain point, all of my opponents ended up just looking like a curved greatsword shaped hole that I needed to fill with this curved greatsword. When in fact, like, now was the time to start using other stuff and getting better at stuff like great axes or great hammers especially. What you end up seeing me use in some of my favorite clips most of the time is great stars with Fire Prelate's Charge on it. I love Fire Prelate's Charge. That is like a very, very, very fun Ash of War that once again just doesn't do that much damage to compete with like the other Doomsday lasers of rune level 168, but it does kind of really induce the panic necessary a lot of the time. I was turned on to Great Star's Prelate Charge by someone I've mentioned on this channel a couple of times actually. He was the same guy who taught me the ways of rings, but he also had this absolutely vile build at like rune level 60 called Rust Eaten Roger that would put, I think, the Blood Flame Blade on Great Stars and then power stance them and use like Prelate's Charge to bleed you out, and then when you're backing away to heal, it would like dual jump attack you with both of these dual Great Stars, which all did bleed build up and really good damage. So by the end you were just like constantly exploding from bleed outs from Blood Flame or because this motherfucker was jumping on you with double Great Stars. Great build. Horrific to fight. I never want to see that shit ever again, man. But anyways, I'm a little bit leaning towards maybe I should just do that with this build. Maybe I should just heavy infuse it, go a little bit heavier into strength, and then Blood Flame infuse it. But here we go. Thanks to freaking Scarlett Aeonia, we don't have any more attunement slots, which is a thing I never thought I'd say in the game Elden Ring. We're not going to get into the whole Scarlett Aeonia thing again, okay? Let's put a stop to this right now. What I do like pairing Great Stars with is an offhand Beast Claw. That is super fun. It adds just a little faster forward momentum mix-up to your like slower main hand a lot of the time. It also has a little bit of innate bleed to it, which is quite nice. And of course, it fits this overall theme of being very connected to nature and like the ways of beasts, right? Which is what this build is all about. If you see me using any other weapons on this build, maybe something like the Blasphemous Blade, my only reasoning is that shit's red, man. Goes on the red build. That's it. That's all I got. Oh, last little bit of housekeeping here. Consumable-wise, I used the hefty fire pots. It was pretty basic stuff. Big red explosion, scales with strength. Mostly use that just to knock people off their horses, or kill them after I've knocked them off their horse in the first place. I've been trying out the Dragon Communion harpoons, and like to nobody's surprise, they're just okay. You can throw them from horseback, but not in the same way that you can do with the Smith Script Spear. You do have to stop Torrent entirely to throw them, which is a bit of a disappointment. Speaking of other disappointments, I tried out the Fire Sprite Stones because those look really cool, and they look like they scaled with Arcane, right? The item description implies that they scale with Arcane. I don't think they really like scale with anything. I've tried using them at a couple other rune levels, and they do like relatively the same amount of damage no matter where you're using them, so they don't really scale with anything. And lastly, I'm using the Azula Beastmen because a lot of people at this stage in the game like summoning the Mimic Tier or like Black Knife Tiche, because that's what, or Tiche, whatever, that got them through the game. I love summoning the Azula Beastmen. It's a very much like, alright, get them boys, and then like my beast dudes who are like using red lightning, they're just like me for real. Just like pop out of nowhere and start going ham on people. Azula Beastmen are beefy. They do pretty good damage for like spirit summons in PvP in Seamless. And they have some decent hits done to them too. So they're pretty useful. I like them a lot, mostly because they fit the build and its themes very, very well. Right before I was recording this video, I did a few more invasions, and I think I have a slightly different tack to take with this build that I think will yield some pretty interesting results. I was trying to think about ways to ensure bleed outs, because one of my biggest pet peeves with bleed outs in Elden Ring, especially on Strength and Arcane builds, are the ghost bleed outs where you just hit the guy, they bleed out on your screen, but they don't take any of the damage. Most people compensate by just not making Strength Arcane builds and just using Dex Arcane builds, and the strategy is just to hit your opponent so many times that one of those is probably going to be a bleed out, and that tends to be a lot more effective. So with that in mind, I was thinking maybe why don't we try some Roarmaxxing? Why don't we use the Roar Medallion and Barbaric Roar on something Occult infused, because Barbaric Roar only buffs, I think, physical damage, so if you had it fire infused, it really wouldn't get the full benefit of that Barbaric Roar. On larger weapons like Great Hammers, Great Axes, etc., Barbaric Roar will guarantee you the first 2 hits of the combo, but not the third. It will also grant you quite a bit of hyper armor. So the idea is that I'm going to hyper armor through an attack. I'm going to bleed him out in those first 2 hits because an occult infused Omenkiller Great Axe has quite a bit of bleed buildup, especially for this level. If I've already hit them with Swarm of Flies, I'm hoping that will also help out my bleed case a little bit more as well. Of the invasions I've done so far, that's worked pretty well. I'm going to do a little bit more invading with it and see how that turns out. Alright, so I did a couple hours worth more of invasions with just the Omenkiller Axe, trying to Roarmax it a little bit with Barbaric Roar. The results were fine. Like, I don't think it really changes that much. I think I'll use this weapon a little bit more with this particular Ash of War, but it really wasn't any sort of like big revelation here. As a weapon, it worked great, and I'll probably just take the extra dex I have on this video and put it back into strength, or maybe Faith or Arcane, you know, one of my damage stats for this build, of which there are somehow 3. But like, my brother in Christ, I made the build. I chose to have 3 different damage stats. Anywho, I liked the Omenkiller Axe. It's pretty fun. I don't get bleed outs as consistently as I thought, but it does some pretty fun stuff. And I think I just have to find the intestinal fortitude within myself to just remove the Omen Cleaver from the build entirely, just so I'm not tempted to go back to it. And just to clarify here, because after like listening to this back, it's a little bit confusing, but when I say the Omen Cleaver, that's like the curved greatsword, because the Omenkiller Great Axe is the Great Axe that I'm talking about. Terminology in this game can get kind of confusing. There's just like so many weapons in the game that I can't really expect everyone to remember exactly what is what at all times. But anyways, more Great Axe, less curved greatsword is the gist of it. Can we talk about the lore? I've been dying to talk about the lore. What's the deal with red in Elden Ring? It keeps showing up everywhere, and I'm not talking about like, ooh, this thing's red. This guy's sword is red. Well, sometimes that happens. But it's more so like, things are named like the Scarlet Rot, or the Giant's red braid, or Radagon's red hair. The red manes. Actually, the red manes is kind of a misnomer here. But not really, because that relates to Radagon's red hair. What does it mean when something is red? It means that it's arcane, which then leads into another question, which is, what does arcane mean in Elden Ring? Arcane to me means something that was like once known and innate in people. I'm not just like human beings in Elden Ring, but I'm talking about like to the land itself. But now it's a little bit lost and esoteric, and people who are super connected to like just the natural order of the world, those people are arcane. Anyone who has a really strong connection to an outer god typically is red. The fire giants were very red, or at least we can kind of assume they are. The only fire giant we get to see who is like a hiding and has an actual god inside of them is also red. Everything to do with the outer god of Scarlet Rot, also red. Now you might say, what about blood? You know, what about just like blood that's everywhere in the Mogwin Palace and Dynasty, or just like bleed-infused weapons. But those are all also relating back to the Formless Mother, an outer god that is, you know, very close by, it seems, in the lands between. I think red is very much something that is like natural in Elden Ring, and that's what it's trying to convey. Maybe it's not natural to us as, you know, people as tarnished in the world, because most of what we know is more similar to like something like the Golden Order. But I think it's something that's very natural to the lands between itself. I've brought up this example before, but if you look at the ancient dragons, all of their lightning is red. And you know what? It's not called like red lightning or ancient dragons red lightning. It's just called like ancient dragons lightning. Because you know what? I think lightning for these ancient dragons just used to be red, and it only became gold when a lot of them converted to the Golden Order during Marika's rule. I think there's also a reason why the Black Blade, like the spell that Malekith uses, and also like everything related to Destined Death, is also all red, because death is like an essential part of the order that made up the old world. The way I view a lot of Elden Ring is that Marika kind of came through and tried to gold wash everything. Everything old needed to be now made into something gold. So to really simplify this theory, which is not very complicated, when something is red, I think it's trying to tell us how old it is, that it predates the Golden Order. That's not to say something can't be co-opted. This is one of the many reasons that I really dislike Radahn as a character. Not that he's badly written, but I hate who he is. He's just kind of like adopting symbols he doesn't really understand like the actual nature of, and is like, that was badass, I like that. He's like Mac from Always Sunny. He's like, red hair is badass. Being really strong and committing genocide is badass, like my stepdad. It's just like stuff like that constantly from Radahn, which makes like the ending of the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC all that more annoying. Like, hey, I'm glad we got to kill him twice, but like, really, Miquella? Really, this is the guy? You were like, oh, he has a kind heart. Yeah, but bestie, he worships like a genocidal maniac. But anyways, this is something that happens constantly in Elden Ring, which I find very interesting, because this also happens like throughout actual history, which is that people co-opt symbols they don't really fully understand for their own purpose. So, in that same vein, let's talk about some stolen valor here. I'm talking about weapons that are red, that do red damage, that looks like arcane kind of damage, but is really just deck scaling, okay? I'm talking about the Dragon Hunter Great Katana, that 100% should be an arcane weapon. Maybe it shouldn't have a huge amount of bleed damage, but like, should be an arcane weapon, right? Same with the Rakshasa Katana, it's covered in blood. It basically looks like a giant version of Rivers of Blood. Really, it's just a dex weapon. I'm also gonna call out stuff like the Bolt of Gransax. Like, it is a lightning bolt used by the ancient dragons. Are you telling me it's really just a dex weapon? Like, you should really have to believe in something or be really in tune with the arcaneness of the world in order to fire a lightning bolt that's red that fast. Come on, man. Anyways, I'm really on one today. I don't know why the color red is making me so damn angry. I feel like a bull in the bull ring. I'm just seeing red and I just get angrier and angrier about it. One last thing I wanted to cover here. Whenever I watch channels like Quelag or the Tarnished Archaeologist, they always like pull something out that I'm like, wait, how did you know that? And it's like, oh, this statue is actually very close to this historical statue. And like this references this obscure culture. And I'm like, how could you possibly know that? That's insane. And in the back of my mind, I'm always a little bit like, are we just recognizing the patterns that we want to see in all this chaos? Like, there's so many assets that go into this game. Are they really all referencing like something historical or something referencing an actual culture that exists? I find that like hard to believe, but then I had like my own moment the other day. And this is a very obscure one. I was taking a look at red weapons in the DLC, and we have all this Blood Fiend stuff. We have the Blood Fiend Arm, the Blood Fiend Sacred Spear, and the Blood Fiend's Fork. Now, none of these weapons I ended up using because, quite honestly, they are not very good. If these bleed weapons were good, you'd see them all over YouTube, and you'd see them a lot more in PvP, but you don't, because, again, they are not very good. But let's take a look at the Blood Fiend's Fork. Now, it's called a fork, not a spear. It's got this distinctive 3-tined point to it, and the item description reads, 3 tines of carved bone spear the victim to provoke blood loss. This weapon, of course, has to do with the Blood Fiends, but more importantly, the Formless Mother, as the next part reads, a ritual implement for blood offerings to the Formless Mother. At times, the Blood Fiends will spill even their own blood using these forks. And so I was taking a look at this 3-tined Blood Fiend fork, and it reminded me of something I saw as a kid. A long time ago, my family took a vacation to Fiji, and one of the souvenirs that they sold everywhere in Fiji, that they would like, somebody would carve it and then they'd sell it to tourists, was these cannibal forks. Cannibalism in Fiji was practiced by quite a few tribes. In fact, a lot of the people there portrayed it as something that was like fairly common before it was outlawed a long time ago, basically. But if you look closely, this is basically the cannibal fork, right? The cannibal fork is set up this way because, according to that ritualistic practice, it was a bad omen or bad luck to have the flesh of another person touch your lips. So they'd essentially put the piece of flesh in the cannibal fork and you put most of that in your mouth. The tines weren't really used for skewering, they were used to like part your lips so they wouldn't touch the flesh inside. This to me pretty much implies that the Blood Fiends like eat each other and like spill each other's blood in worship of the Formless Mother. I think there's a couple locations, or maybe just one, where you can see that the Blood Fiends seem to be like hunched over a body or like another sleeping Blood Fiend, which happens kind of frequently. But this is like just such an insane reference. Like, who would get that this is the Fijian cannibal fork? And here is FromSoft using it to imply like cannibalism among a tiny faction that really isn't that important to the greater story of the Shadow of the Erdtree. The amount of historical references that just exist in Elden Ring through like non-verbal means really blows my mind. So yeah, that was my small, very minor lore discovery that you probably could have figured out just by looking at what the Blood Fiends are up to and reading this item description. But just wanted to let you know that this is in reference to real-life cannibals. Well, that is about it for me for this video, guys. I don't think I'm gonna make a clip dump video on this. I really don't love invading at this rune level range, and as a result, I don't have a ton of extra footage to make like a whole nother video. In fact, I've just kind of moved on and started working on another caster, and this one so far has been coming together a lot better than the red Druid. So I'm very, very excited for the next video I make after this, as long as that caster continues to perform fairly well. As I'm sure you all know, I'm not really one of those people who like keeps track of their wins and losses. Like sometimes I'll go on Twitch or YouTube and I'll see like a Elden Ring invasion stream, and they'll have in the right hand corner like, here's my current wins and losses, or here's my current win rate, and I'll just immediately close the tab. But I do like to make builds that are actually effective, and not just effective at killing the dumbest people in the world. Sure, you can style on the dumbest people in the world a little bit more, but like, if I'm only killing those people, then I'm probably doing something wrong with these builds. And I guess that's kind of the thing about Elden Ring versus like Dark Souls 3, whereas I've really at no point really cared about how skillful I was at Elden Ring. I feel like you can just make an effective build and that will kill people, and it's not really like so much of what you're doing. You're just like pressing the buttons to get the engine to push out the result, which is the host vanquish screen, right? Whereas in Dark Souls 3, I really felt like you had to outspace people, you had to really outplay people, and I just never really feel that in Elden Ring. That being said, I'm still having a lot of fun with this game. Like, I don't need to be the most skillful player in the world, and I don't really even need to feel like I need to get better as a player in a game like Elden Ring. And I think that's probably a good thing. I don't feel any pressure when I play this game. I want to collect good clips for videos because I like making videos and I like interacting with you all. But like, you know, when I get smoked by another player who just like absolutely dominates me, I'm like, okay, yeah, fair enough. You earned that. And when people suggest stuff like we need leaderboards back, that's always kind of like a dead end for me, because I'm just like, what's the point of like being the best Elden Ring player in a game that really doesn't reward skill all that much? Which again, is totally fine. Invasions are silly and they're goofy, and I'm kind of just there to win, not like prove I'm the most skilled player. So that is all to say, I'm kind of trying to keep track in my head of like how many invasions I win versus lose, so I don't feel like I'm selling you all a bill of goods, like, make this unstoppable build, and then you try it out and you just get smoked the entire time. Like, I don't want that to happen. So I'm trying to make builds that are like somewhat effective while still being a little bit more off the beaten path. But if you've watched this channel for a while, you probably already get that vibe from me. So anyways, that's all from me, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.